November rain hit like needles the morning I walked out of Oregon State Correctional Institution. It poured so hard that the prison walls blurred behind a gray curtain, as if the world wanted to erase the last 9 years before I had even taken my first step toward freedom. Everything I owned fit inside a worn paper bag: a dead cell phone, a wallet holding $43, and an old wristwatch my father had given me on my 30th birthday. 9 years. 9 years locked away for a crime I never committed. The world had moved on without asking whether I deserved to be left behind. My name is Frank Callahan. I'm 64 years old. Before prison, I built Callahan Freight Solutions from a single truck parked outside a rented warehouse into one of the largest regional logistics companies in the Pacific Northwest. At its peak, we employed more than 400 people across 11 states. I wasn't born into money. Every dollar, every warehouse, every contract had been earned, 1 mile at a time. Back then, I believed hard work protected a man. I was wrong. The people closest to me destroyed everything I had spent 40 years building. It started in the spring of 2015. Federal agents walked into my headquarters carrying boxes of financial records. They laid document after document across the conference table. Shell corporations, offshore accounts, fake invoices, payments made to companies that didn't exist. Then the man I had trusted with my books for over a decade looked investigators straight in the eye and calmly testified that I had ordered every fraudulent transaction myself. I remember staring at him, waiting for him to laugh. He never did. My attorney later told me it was one of the most sophisticated financial setups he had ever seen. None of that mattered once the jury saw a wealthy businessman surrounded by mountains of paperwork that all pointed in one direction: mine. They sentenced me to 12 years. Good behavior reduced it to 9. Those years taught me something prison movies never show. The worst punishment isn't the cell. It's watching your old life disappear while you're powerless to stop it. My wife Carol visited twice during the first year. She cried, held my hands across the plastic table, promised she believed I was innocent, promised she would wait. 14 months later, divorce papers arrived instead. Her letter was barely half a page. She wrote that she couldn't spend the rest of her life waiting for someone behind bars. She had found someone who could actually be there. Months later, I discovered that someone was Dennis Hartley, my business partner, my closest friend, the man who had stood beside me at my wedding. By then, betrayal had almost become routine, but nothing hurt like what happened to my daughter. Lauren was 27 when I was arrested. She had a successful marketing career, a fiancé she adored, and a future that looked brighter than anything I had imagined for her growing up. The day I was convicted, everything around her collapsed. Clients disappeared. Her company quietly let her go. Her fiancé's family convinced him that marrying the daughter of a convicted felon would destroy his future. Within months, she had lost her career, her engagement, and the life she had worked so hard to build. She never told me any of that. Not at first. For nearly 2 years, her letters arrived every week. They were cheerful. Too cheerful. She wrote about books she was reading, coffee shops she wanted me to visit someday, little stories that made prison walls feel less cold. Looking back now, I realize every letter was carefully edited. She wasn't telling me about her life. She was protecting me from it. Eventually, the letters became shorter. Then they stopped altogether. Phone calls replaced them. Whenever I asked how she was doing, the answer never changed. "I'm okay, Dad." she wasn't. And there was nothing I could do from inside a concrete box. Only after my release did I learn the rest. Lauren had moved to Tacoma. She was raising her young son, Marcus, alone after his father walked away. She worked long hours, managing the front office of a small dental clinic. She drove an aging car with more than 200,000 miles on it. She clipped grocery coupons just to stretch each paycheck. Meanwhile, Dennis Hartley was living in my house, sleeping in my bed, running my company, giving interviews where reporters introduced him as the visionary founder of Callahan Freight Solutions. My name had quietly disappeared from the story I had written. Most men would have exploded the day they found out. I didn't. Prison teaches patience in ways nothing else can. Rage burns fast. Patience survives. 3 days after my release, I met a man named Ray Decker in a small diner outside Portland. Ray was a retired homicide detective with silver hair, tired eyes, and the habit of studying everyone before speaking. He already knew who I was. "I always believed something about your conviction didn't add up," he admitted as he stirred his coffee. Those words were the first real hope I'd heard in nearly a decade. Then he slid a thick folder across the table. "Before you open that," he said quietly, "you need to understand something." I looked at him. "The people who destroyed your life didn't just frame you." He paused. "They planned every step, years before anyone knocked on your office door." Ray waited until the waitress walked away before opening the folder. "I spent the last 6 months pulling at threads," he said. "The more I pulled, the uglier it became." Inside were photographs, bank records, corporate filings, property transfers, and handwritten notes connected with colored tabs. Every page carried another piece of the life that had been stolen from me. "Dennis didn't wake up one morning and decide to frame you," Ray continued. "He started stealing from the company years before the investigation. At first, the amounts were small. A few $1,000s here, a fake vendor payment there. Nothing large enough to trigger alarms. But greed has a way of growing faster than common sense. Within a few years, the missing money had reached a level that even a routine audit would expose. He knew he couldn't hide it forever," Ray said. "So he created someone to blame. Me." Ray nodded once. "You." He explained that Dennis hadn't acted alone. Carol had helped gather personal documents that only a spouse could easily access. Copies of my signatures, financial records, identity documents. Everything needed to make forged paperwork look authentic. Then Dennis hired a forensic accountant named Steve Molina. Steve's job wasn't simply to hide stolen money. His job was to redirect every trail toward me. Every shell company, every fake invoice, every offshore transfer, every forged authorization. By the time federal investigators arrived, the evidence didn't just suggest I was guilty. It practically screamed it. I leaned back in the booth and closed my eyes. For 9 years, I had replayed the trial, wondering where everything had gone wrong. Now I finally understood. Nothing had gone wrong. Everything had gone exactly the way Dennis intended. "What about Steve?" I asked. Ray took a sip of coffee before answering. "He lives in Boise now." "He's still working?" "Barely." Ray slid another photograph across the table. The man staring back at me looked exhausted. Gray circles under his eyes. Wrinkled shirt. The face of someone who hadn't slept well in years. "Dennis stopped paying him after your conviction," Ray said. left him hanging. Has anyone talked to him? I have. And? He didn't deny a thing. That answer stayed with me. An innocent man spends years begging people to believe him. A guilty man spends years hoping nobody asks the right question. Steve, apparently, had grown tired of carrying both fear and guilt. Ray folded his hands. I think he'll talk. You trust him? No. He smiled faintly. But I trust regret. For the next 3 weeks, I disappeared. I didn't call former employees. I didn't drive past my old house. I didn't confront Dennis. Prison had taught me something that business never had. Timing matters more than emotion. Before facing the people who destroyed my life, there was one person I needed to see. Lauren. Her apartment sat in a quiet neighborhood outside Tacoma. Small, clean, ordinary. Nothing about it resembled the house where she'd grown up. When she opened the door, she froze. For several long seconds, neither of us spoke. Then her eyes filled with tears. Dad. That single word carried 9 years of pain. She wrapped her arms around me so tightly I thought she might never let go. Neither of us cared that we were standing in the doorway, while rain soaked both our jackets. Inside, we sat at the tiny kitchen table for hours. She finally told me everything she had hidden. Losing her job, losing Tom, moving away, starting over, working overtime, raising Marcus alone, pretending everything was fine every time she answered one of my prison phone calls. I couldn't tell you, she whispered. You were already trapped. There wasn't anything you could have done. I lowered my eyes. She was right. That truth hurt more than any prison sentence ever had. For a while, neither of us spoke. The apartment was quiet except for the sound of a little boy humming softly from the next room. Lauren smiled through her tears. Marcus is doing homework. She looked at me. He's been asking about you. Before I could answer, she called toward the hallway. Buddy, can you come in here for a minute? Small footsteps echoed across the floor. A 6-year-old boy appeared, holding a math worksheet and a yellow pencil tucked behind one ear. He looked at me with complete honesty. No fear, no judgment, only curiosity. Lauren rested a hand on his shoulder. Marcus, this is your grandfather. The little boy studied me for several seconds. Then he asked the question every adult had been afraid to ask. Were you really in prison? I was. His head tilted. Did you do the bad thing? No, I didn't. He thought quietly. Then his face brightened. Like the innocent people we learned about at school? I couldn't help smiling. Exactly like that. Marcus nodded once, completely satisfied. Then he pulled out the chair beside me. Can you help me with fractions? I laughed for the first time in nearly a decade. At that moment, I stopped thinking about revenge. I started thinking about what was worth fighting for. That evening, after Marcus had gone to bed, Lauren and I sat on the small balcony outside her apartment. The rain had finally stopped. For the first time since leaving prison, I felt something I hadn't allowed myself to feel in years. Hope. Lauren wrapped both hands around a mug of tea. What are you going to do now? I'm going to finish what they started. She looked at me carefully. Dad, Dennis has money, lawyers, connections. He's had 9 years to make sure nobody questions what happened. I know. And we have... She laughed softly, though there wasn't much humor in it. A 2-bedroom apartment and a car that's falling apart. I smiled. We also have something Dennis doesn't. She raised an eyebrow. What's that? The truth. She didn't answer immediately. Instead, she studied my face, searching for the anger she expected to find. What she saw instead surprised her. I wasn't angry anymore. Prison had burned that out of me years ago. What remained was focus. I didn't spend 9 years dreaming about revenge, I said quietly. I spent 9 years learning patience. I've had more time to think than Dennis has had to lie. And sooner or later, truth catches up. Lauren nodded slowly. I want to believe that. You will. A week later, Ray called. I found Steve. Where? Boise. He agreed to meet. I left before sunrise the next morning. The drive gave me too much time to think. I wondered what kind of man willingly helped destroy another person's life. More importantly, I wondered what kind of man lived with that decision for nearly a decade. Steve Molina was waiting inside a quiet coffee shop near downtown. He looked older than his 50-something years. His shoulders slumped. His eyes rarely stayed in one place. He looked like someone who had been carrying an invisible weight for a very long time. When I sat across from him, he recognized me instantly. For several seconds, neither of us spoke. Finally, he sighed. I knew this day would come. So did I. His fingers tightened around his coffee cup. I've rehearsed this conversation hundreds of times. Then don't waste either of our time. Tell me the truth. He closed his eyes. When Dennis first approached me, he said the company needed adjustments. I remained silent. He claimed you were already hiding money. He said he just needed someone who understood forensic accounting to reorganize the records. You believed him? Steve looked down. I wanted to. He swallowed hard. The money was good, so I convinced myself rich businessmen were all dishonest anyway. His voice cracked. I told myself I wasn't ruining an innocent man's life. But after the trial, I realized exactly what I'd done. I stared at him. And yet you stayed quiet. I was afraid. Of Dennis? Steve nodded. He reminded me more than once that I had signed every document. If I talked, I'd go to prison too. The irony wasn't lost on either of us. Fear had kept one guilty man free, while another innocent man spent 9 years behind bars. Steve slowly reached into his briefcase. I never destroyed anything. He placed a thick envelope on the table. I kept copies. Every original spreadsheet, every altered ledger, every email Dennis had sent, every payment record, every instruction. Insurance. That's what Steve had called it. Insurance against the very man who eventually abandoned him. I carefully opened the envelope. Within seconds, I realized what I was holding. This wasn't simply evidence. It was the blueprint of the entire conspiracy. Steve watched my expression. I know an apology isn't enough. No, it isn't. I can't give you back 9 years. No, you can't. His eyes filled with tears. I've thought about your daughter almost every day. That caught me off guard. He continued. I saw an article after your conviction. It mentioned she lost her career. That's when I stopped sleeping. Silence settled between us. Finally, I asked the only question that mattered. Will you testify? Steve didn't answer immediately. He looked out the window for a long time before speaking. If I do, my life is over. I leaned forward. No. It finally begins. You've already spent 9 years living in your own prison. The only difference is, nobody locked your cell. He stared at me. Then he slowly nodded. I'll testify. I'll tell them everything. For the first time since the courtroom doors closed behind me 9 years earlier, the odds had finally begun to change. When I walked back to my car carrying Steve's evidence, I wasn't carrying paperwork. I was carrying the first real crack in the foundation Dennis Hartley had spent nearly a decade building. He still believed his secret was buried forever. He had no idea. Someone had already started digging. When I returned to Portland, Ray was waiting in his office. I placed Steve Molina's envelope on the desk without saying a word. Ray opened it slowly. The deeper he read, the wider his eyes became. My God. He carefully removed another stack of documents. Original accounting ledgers, unedited balance sheets, copies of offshore wire transfers, printed email chains. Every page matched the timeline he had already spent months building. This is enough to reopen everything, he said quietly. It has to be. It is. But reopening my case wasn't enough. I wanted the people responsible to answer for every decision they had made, not just in court, but face to face. For the next 2 weeks, Ray and I worked almost every day. We hired an independent forensic accountant to verify Steve's records. Every transaction checked out. Nothing had been fabricated. A digital forensic specialist recovered email archives Dennis believed had been erased years earlier. They weren't gone. Hidden, maybe. Forgotten. But not gone. One email made my stomach tighten. Dennis had written only 7 words. Make sure everything points back to Frank. There it was. Not suspicion. Not implication. A direct instruction. Signed with his own name. Ray leaned back in his chair. I've seen murder cases with less evidence than this. I closed the laptop. Then it's time. I called Dennis that afternoon. He answered on the 3rd ring. Frank? His voice sounded calm, comfortable, as though the past 9 years had been nothing more than an unfortunate misunderstanding. I heard you were released. How are you holding up? I'm doing just fine. There was a brief silence. I'd like to come by the house. Another pause. The house? Sunday morning. 9 o'clock. Dennis hesitated. I'm not sure that's a good idea. Carol might. Tell Carol I'll be there. I ended the call before he could say anything else. Sunday morning arrived gray and cold. Ray had offered to come with me. I refused. This meeting belonged to me. I borrowed his old sedan instead of renting something expensive. I wore a plain jacket, faded jeans, and shoes that had seen better days. I wanted Dennis to believe exactly what he'd imagined for 9 years. That prison had broken me. That I had come looking for pity. As I pulled into the driveway, memories hit me harder than I expected. I had planted the maple tree near the mailbox myself. Lauren had learned to ride her first bicycle on this driveway. Every brick, every window, every inch of that property carried part of my life. Now another man's SUV sat where mine used to be. Before I reached the porch, the front door opened. Carol stood there. Time had changed her face, but not enough to erase recognition. For a brief moment, she looked genuinely shaken. Then the expression disappeared. "Frank." She almost smiled. Almost. "Hello, Carol." She stepped aside without another word. The house looked beautiful. Too beautiful. New furniture, fresh paint, expensive artwork. Everything that had once reflected our family had vanished. Not a single photograph remained. It felt less like walking into my home and more like touring a luxury hotel built on top of old memories. Dennis waited beside the fireplace. Cashmere sweater, expensive watch, perfect posture. The image of a successful businessman. "Frank." He extended his hand. "It's good to see you." I looked at it for a moment, then sat down without shaking it. His smile faded almost instantly. Carol quietly remained near the hallway, watching both of us. Dennis finally broke the silence. "I know you've been through a difficult time. I truly am sorry for everything that happened." I looked directly into his eyes. "You should be." He shifted uncomfortably. "I've spent years wondering how things went so wrong." "I haven't." His forehead tightened. "What do you mean?" "I know exactly what happened." Neither of them moved. I slowly placed a thick folder onto the coffee table. I met Steve Molina. Dennis's face lost every trace of color. Carol's breathing became noticeably heavier. I continued speaking calmly. He told me everything. The fake companies, the forged signatures, the offshore accounts, the altered ledgers, the money you stole, and exactly how you convinced the government it all belonged to me. Dennis forced a laugh. "Frank, I don't know what kind of story someone sold you." I pressed a button on my phone. Steve's recorded voice filled the room. Every sentence was clear, every detail precise. He explained the fraud, the forged documents, Dennis's instructions, the payments, the cover-up. The recording lasted less than 4 minutes. It felt much longer. When it ended, no one spoke. For the first time in nearly 10 years, Dennis Hartley looked afraid. Dennis stared at the phone in my hand as if he could somehow make the recording disappear. When he finally spoke, his confidence was gone. "That recording doesn't prove anything." I smiled. "You're right. It doesn't have to." I reached into my briefcase and placed another folder beside the first. "This does." Inside were copies of the original accounting records Steve had preserved. Next came the independent forensic accountant's report, explaining exactly how the company books had been manipulated over several years. Then came the digital forensic analysis. Finally, I laid several printed emails on the coffee table. Dennis recognized them immediately. I could see it in his face before he touched a single page. "You remember these?" I asked. He didn't answer. "You should. You wrote them." One message was highlighted in yellow. "Make sure everything points back to Frank." Another instructed Steve to create additional shell companies under my identity. A third discussed transferring money before the annual audit. Every email carried Dennis's name. Every timestamp matched the financial records. Every piece fit perfectly. The silence inside the living room became unbearable. Carol slowly lowered herself into a chair. She looked exhausted. Not surprised, just exhausted. Almost as if she had spent years waiting for this exact morning. Dennis finally found his voice. "What do you want?" It was the first honest question he'd asked since I walked through the front door. "I want my company. I want my house. I want every dollar you stole while I was sitting in a prison cell. And I want the truth." He laughed bitterly. "You think you'll just walk back into your old life?" "No. I know I won't. My old life ended 9 years ago. I'm here to build a new one." Dennis leaned forward. "You have no idea what a legal fight like this will cost." "I've already paid more than you ever will." He opened his mouth again. I raised my hand. "I'm not here to negotiate. I'm here to give you a choice." I slid one final document across the table. It wasn't a lawsuit. It wasn't a settlement agreement. It was a letter from my attorney, informing him that federal prosecutors would receive every piece of evidence within 48 hours, along with Steve Molina's sworn statement, along with the forensic reports, along with the recovered emails. Dennis read the first page, then the second. His hands began to shake. "You planned all this?" "For years. For 9 years." I looked him straight in the eye. "No, you planned this. You simply forgot one thing." "What's that?" "You thought prison would make me quit." Carol suddenly spoke, very quietly. "What happens to me?" Dennis turned toward her in disbelief. "What are you doing?" She ignored him. Her eyes remained fixed on me. I took a slow breath before answering. "If you cooperate completely, I won't ask prosecutors to pursue additional charges against you. I'll leave that decision to them. But if you lie, if you hide anything, I'll make sure every document with your name reaches the public record." She closed her eyes. For several seconds, no one moved. Then she whispered something Dennis never expected to hear. "I'm done." He stared at her. "What?" "I'm done protecting you. You told me none of this would ever come back. You said Frank would never recover. You promised me we'd be safe." Dennis stood so quickly his chair nearly tipped over. "Carol, don't be ridiculous." She looked at him with empty eyes. "No. I've been ridiculous for 9 years. You convinced me that one lie would solve everything. It didn't. It destroyed everyone, including us." The room fell silent again. Whatever had kept their marriage together wasn't love. It was fear. And fear has a very short life once the truth arrives. Dennis looked at me one last time. "This isn't over." I stood. "No, it isn't. But for the first time, you know how that feels." 11 days later, the negotiations ended. Dennis's attorneys tried every argument imaginable. They questioned witnesses. They challenged documents. They threatened civil lawsuits. Nothing worked. The evidence was overwhelming. Steve testified. The forensic accountants confirmed the fraud. Digital experts authenticated every recovered email. One by one, the walls Dennis had spent nearly a decade building came crashing down. Rather than face a public trial he couldn't possibly win, Dennis accepted a federal plea agreement. He admitted to tax fraud, financial forgery, conspiracy, and the deliberate framing of an innocent man. When the judge accepted the plea, I didn't celebrate. There was no applause, no dramatic speech, only silence. 9 years had been taken from me. No courtroom could ever return them. But for the first time since those prison gates closed behind me, the truth finally belonged to the public record. And that was something Dennis could never steal again. The headline spread faster than I expected. Former business executive exonerated after massive fraud conspiracy uncovered. For nearly a decade, people had known my name for all the wrong reasons. Now they were finally learning the truth. Dennis Hartley pleaded guilty to federal tax fraud, conspiracy, financial forgery, and orchestrating the scheme that had sent an innocent man to prison. The sentence was 10 years in federal custody. Whether he served every day of it no longer mattered to me. Justice had finally caught him. Carol cooperated with investigators exactly as promised. Her testimony confirmed details that Steve's documents couldn't. She admitted she had provided personal records that allowed Dennis to open financial accounts in my name. In exchange for her full cooperation, prosecutors chose not to pursue additional charges. After signing the final statement, she left Oregon to live with her sister. That was the last I ever heard of her. Steve Molina also accepted responsibility. His cooperation became one of the key reasons the government rebuilt the entire timeline of the fraud. He received probation, financial penalties, and a permanent end to his career as a forensic accountant. Several weeks later, a handwritten letter arrived at my house. It was from Steve. He apologized. Not with excuses, not with explanations, just regret. He admitted he could never repay the years he had helped steal from me. I folded the letter, placed it inside my desk drawer, and closed it. Forgiveness wasn't something that arrived because someone asked for it. Sometimes the healthiest thing a person can do is simply move forward. Getting the company back turned out to be harder than proving my innocence. On paper, Callahan Freight Solutions was still profitable. In reality, Dennis had been keeping it alive with short-term decisions that sacrificed its future. Major clients had quietly left. Equipment hadn't been replaced. Managers with decades of experience had resigned. The company I had once loved was still standing, but only barely. The board of directors voted to restore my ownership after the legal process concluded. Walking back into headquarters felt strangely familiar. My name had been returned to the building, but almost every face inside had changed. Many employees knew me only from old photographs. Some remembered the day federal agents had walked me out in handcuffs. A few avoided eye contact. Others walked over and shook my hand. One warehouse supervisor, a man who had worked for me for nearly 20 years, simply smiled and said, "Welcome home, boss." Those 3 words meant more than any courtroom victory ever could. Lauren eventually moved back to Portland, not because I asked her to, because she wanted a fresh beginning. She chose not to work for the company. I respected that completely. She had built a life without depending on anyone, including me. Instead, she found a new position she genuinely enjoyed, closer to Marcus's school. Watching her rebuild on her own terms made me prouder than any business success I'd ever achieved. Marcus settled into his new school quickly. He loved drawing. Every week, he seemed to bring home another sketchbook filled with trucks, bridges, mountains, and imaginary cities. Apparently, he had inherited an eye for design from his grandmother, and my stubbornness. Every Saturday became ours. Breakfast at the same little diner, chocolate pancakes for him, black coffee and eggs for me. We talked about school, baseball, homework, the mysteries of why adults made life so complicated. One morning, he looked up from his pancakes and asked, "Grandpa, were you angry while you were in prison?" The question caught me off guard. I thought carefully before answering. I was. For a while. What changed? I realized anger was helping the people who hurt me. It wasn't helping me. He nodded slowly. trying to understand.
So, what did you do instead?
I got patient. He smiled. I think patience is harder. It is.
That's why so few people choose it.
Months later, I found Steve's letter again while cleaning my office. This time, I read every word. Then I folded it once more and placed it back inside the drawer. Not because I wanted to hold on to the past, but because I wanted to remember what happens when good people convince themselves that one dishonest decision won't matter. It always matters. People often ask whether the government compensated me for the 9 years I lost. The answer is yes, but no amount of money can buy back birthdays that never happened, Christmas mornings, family dinners, the first 6 years of a grandson's life. There are losses that no settlement can repair. I accepted the compensation because it acknowledged what had been done, not because it erased it. Nothing ever could. One autumn evening, nearly a year after returning home, I sat on the back porch, watching the sun disappear behind the Oregon hills. Inside the house, Lauren and Marcus were arguing about where the forks belonged on the dinner table. Marcus insisted they should go wherever made the most sense. Lauren insisted there was a proper place for everything. Their laughter drifted through the open window. I smiled without realizing it. For years, I believed I was fighting to reclaim my company. Then I thought I was fighting to reclaim my reputation. In the end, neither of those things mattered most. What I truly wanted was this: an ordinary evening, a family dinner, a grandson asking impossible questions, a daughter who could finally laugh again. Those simple moments were worth more than every building, every contract, and every dollar I had ever earned. The people who betrayed me believed they had erased my future. What they actually did was teach me the value of every ordinary day that remained. My name is Frank Callahan. 9 years ago, I walked into prison with everything to lose. 9 years later, I walked out carrying only $43 and an old wristwatch. Today, I have something far more valuable: my family, my name, and the certainty that truth may take its time, but it never stops moving. If you're carrying the weight of a betrayal that feels impossible to overcome, remember this: be patient. Keep the evidence. Stand by the truth. One day, the people who counted on your silence may find themselves standing where you once stood. And when that day comes, let the truth do the talking.